Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are finally getting around to checking out Intel's new Tiger Lake mobile processors, starting with the Core i7-1165G7, the part that will be seen in most mainstream high-end ultra-portable laptops. Intel announced their Tiger Lake lineup many months ago. Systems have been on store shelves for a little while as well, but with so many hardware releases in the last few months, it's taken us until now to get systems on hand and put them through our benchmark suite. So Tiger Lake and the Core i7-1165G7 is an overhaul of Intel's previous mobile offerings, in particular Ice Lake, which launched with rather mediocre performance last year. With AMD storming into the mobile market in early 2020 with their Zen 2-based Ryzen 4000 lineup, which in most instances destroyed Intel's previous offerings in terms of performance, Tiger Lake is Intel's big response that's filled with new features. Perhaps the biggest update for Intel is the new 10nm superfin process. 10nm has been problematic for Intel over the last few years to say the least, but for a low-power mobile CPU, 10nm superfin finally seems up to the task for next-generation CPU architectures. On this node, Intel are able to significantly increase both CPU and GPU clock speeds compared to 10nm Ice Lake products at the same power class, which provides the bulk of the performance improvements on offer with the Core i7-1165G7 over the i7-1065G7. On top of this, there have been some minor updates to the CPU core design, moving from Sunny Cove up to Willow Cove. Most notably, cache sizes have increased from 8MB of L3 on previous top-end quad cores up to 12MB. We also get a much larger GPU design based on Intel's new Xe architecture, packing 96 execution units, higher frequency memory support, new features like Thunderbolt 4 and PCIe 4.0, and better hardware acceleration for video encoding and decoding. Today we're looking at the Core i7-1165G7 specifically, which is Intel's second from top and most widely used Tiger Lake UP3 processor. UP3 is essentially what used to be called U-Series, so in that 15W power range. It packs 4 Willow Cove CPU cores and 8 threads, which is a deficit on AMD's 8-core design they are currently offering in this power class. However, Intel are attempting to make up for that with high clock speeds. With this generation, Intel have changed how they are reporting key metrics like base clock, instead giving us this value for just 28W and 12W configurations instead of the default 15W. So we are seeing a 2.8GHz base at 28W, which is much higher than the 1.5GHz base that the Ice Lake Core i7-1065G7 offered at 25W. However, the base frequency gain is much lower at 12W, just 200MHz higher than we previously had in this class. Ice Lake's fairly restrictive frequency cap, brought about by issues with the 10nm node they were using at the time, has also been lifted thanks to 10nm superfin. Boost clocks with the 1165G7 now top out at 4.7GHz on a single thread, compared to a rather pathetic 3.9GHz with the 1065G7 in comparison. And then we have the GPU upgraded from a Gen 11 design to XeLP. This brings with it a host of improvements, including 96 execution units versus 64 previously, as well as a maximum frequency bump from 1.1 to 1.3GHz. Like with the CPU core, Intel are touting much higher frequencies at all voltages with this new Xe design. These are the basics of the new 1165G7 design. We've talked a bit more about this in previous videos covering the launch and architecture disclosures if you're interested in further information, but basically this isn't just a simple 100 to 200MHz frequency bump on existing architectures like we got for years in the Skylake era. This is a substantial overhaul. Unfortunately, the name didn't receive the same treatment. Core i7-1165G7 remains one of the worst named CPUs in the industry right now. For today's benchmark review, we'll be going through productivity and gaming benchmarks comparing the 1165G7 at both 15W and 28W power levels to other U-Series mobile CPUs like Ryzen, Ice Lake, Comet Lake, and so on. There's a lot of benchmarking to get through, so strap yourselves in. We're very lucky to have received 4 i7-1165G7 laptops when compiling this review, which gives us the most comprehensive data we've ever had for this sort of launch. So let's run through the test systems. First up, we have Intel's new NUC M15, branded as the Schenker Vision 15. This is Intel's 15-inch Tiger Lake reference design that they are offering to OEMs, which is quite nice overall with that MacBook-like aesthetic. It has the 1165G7 running at 28W or even higher at times, although we left it at 28W in the default power profile. 16GB of LPDDR4X memory and plenty of adequate cooling, which keeps it pretty quiet, plus a 1080p display. Next up, we have the XMG Core 14, a powerful 14-inch portable system that packs both an 1165G7 at up to 28 watts and an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1650 discrete GPU. 32GB of dual-channel DDR4 3200 memory here, plus a 512GB Samsung SSD and a 1080p display. It's not the slimmest system going around, but this thing packs a serious punch in this form factor with that GPU inside, and as you'll see in some of the compute benchmarks, it is substantially faster than these other laptops for GPU acceleration, making it, of course, the fastest laptop that we're looking at today. Then we come to the Dell Inspiron 14700, which I bought for testing. It has the Core i7-1165G7 inside, running up to 20 watts long term, although for this review we're using the 15 watt power profile. It also features NVIDIA GeForce MX350 discrete graphics, 16GB of LPDDR4X memory, and a 2560x1600 display. Quite like this system as well, given its premium build and portable nature. Finally, we have the Schenker Via 14, a more portability-focused 14-inch laptop, which also features the i7-1165G7 at up to 20 watts, but for this review we're using the 15 watt power profile. 16GB of dual-channel DDR4 3200 memory, a 1080p display, and a nice slim chassis that's perfect for a laptop that relies solely on integrated graphics. The reason we have chosen these power profiles to use with these laptops specifically, even if they are not the highest profile available in some instances, is to give us the best apples-to-apples comparisons with chips that we've already tested, mostly at either 15 watts or 25 watts. As we've talked about previously, the power level is crucial in laptop form factors, as while a higher power level delivers better performance, it also requires more cooling, so either a thicker or louder design. We don't think it's fair to compare one CPU running at 15 watts in, say, a slim and light chassis with limited cooling, to a beefier design with a discrete GPU running at 28 watts. However, we have left boost configurations as default, with all of these Tiger Lake systems boosting between 35 and 50 watts for varying periods of time, sometimes for multiple minutes. The results you'll see in the following charts are an average of benchmark runs across laptops with the same configuration. We've tested multiple laptops for nearly all the CPUs in this chart, so this should give you a generalized look at performance. OEMs can, of course, configure their laptops however they like, so you might see a 5% difference from the average results at the same power level, depending on the laptop you buy. That's generally what we've seen. If you're thinking of getting an ultra-thin laptop, then the 15 watt numbers will be more in line with what you'll see, whereas those buying more premium and larger designs should look more closely at the 25 watt plus numbers. Let's get into the benchmarking, and we'll start with Cinebench R20, the benchmark Intel are begging people not to use. Being a multi-threaded workload, this is not a strong suit of Intel's Tiger Lake platform, given that it has just 4 cores compared to 6 and 8 cores for most of AMD's Ryzen lineup. As a result, in the higher power class, the 1165G7 is not very competitive here, falling 30% behind the Ryzen 7 4700U and 45% behind the Ryzen 7 4800U. At 15 watts, these margins are even higher. However, there is some good news here when comparing to other Intel processors. At 28 watts versus 25 watts for the 1065G7, Intel's new Tiger Lake design is a healthy 24% faster thanks to much higher sustained multi-core clock speeds. However, at 15 watts, the gains aren't as substantial, with the 1165G7 pulling just 12% ahead. It seems that 10nm SuperFin plays much more nicely at 28 watts than it does at 15 watts, which would explain Intel's strong focus on the higher power configuration. At the end of the day though, in this benchmark, the 1165G7 can't match the Ryzen 5 4500U in multi-thread performance. While Tiger Lake's Cinebench multi-thread performance is unimpressive, the opposite is true for single-thread. The 1165G7 is easily the fastest mobile CPU we've tested for single-thread performance, outperforming all other designs by a substantial amount. The 1165G7 at 28 watts is 23% faster than the Ryzen 7 4800U, AMD's fastest Renoir design. However, to boost up to 4.8 GHz, a single Willow Cove CPU core actually consumes more than 15 watts of power. It's more around the 20 to 22 watt mark in my testing, which is why when Tiger Lake is configured at its default 15 watt TDP, single thread performance drops outside the boost period. This is in contrast to AMD's design, which is able to run a single core at below 15 watts, so Ryzen sees a negligible performance reduction at 15 watts. The end result is that while the 1165G7 is 23% faster than the 4800U at a higher power level, it's only 15% faster at 15 watts. With that said, overall the single thread performance is still very impressive, and clearly the ability to boost up to 4.7 GHz is giving Intel a strong win here, noting that the 4800U only tops out at 4.2 GHz. Seeing a U-series class processor beat every H-series chip as well is quite unusual and could make a Tiger Lake laptop the best choice if you have a single-threaded productivity workload. Next up is Handbrake, which tests CPU encoding over a prolonged period. As this is a multi-threaded test, Tiger Lake is underwhelming, failing to beat the Ryzen 5 4500U. While the 1165G7 is faster than the 1065G7, 16% faster at 28 watts and 8% faster at 15 watts, that's nowhere near the required amount to bridge the gap to Ryzen with just a quad-core design. The Ryzen 7 4800U is especially impressive here at 15 watts, absolutely destroying the 1165G7. It's a very similar story with Blender CPU encoding, where once again Tiger Lake falls substantially behind Renoir for multi-core performance. While the 1165G7 benefits from a healthy 21% performance gain over the 1065G7 at 28 to 25 watts, that isn't quite enough to beat the 15-watt Ryzen 5 4500U, showing that Intel's quad-core design isn't really ideal for efficiency in these workloads. In GCC compilation and Cygwin, the Core i7-1165G7 is not a particularly great choice, producing compilation times only slightly better than the Core i7-1065G7. This means that Tiger Lake falls well behind AMD's Ryzen processors again for heavy code compilation work, although I do suspect this will vary depending on the compile. The more single-threaded, the better the results will be for Tiger Lake, but as soon as multi-threading comes into play, then the 1165G7 gets left behind. It's a somewhat better story in Chromium compilation, as the 1165G7 is at least competitive with the Ryzen 5 4500U at 25 watts and 28 watts, but it still gets outperformed by AMD's higher-end Zen 2 APUs. MATLAB's built-in benchmark uses a combination of multi-threaded, single-threaded, and memory-heavy functions. Here the Core i7-1165G7 is a very strong competitor, edging out the 1065G7 by 17% at 28 watts and 8% at 15 watts, to be the fastest overall U-series processor. The additional frequency offered to Tiger Lake allows it to retake the performance crown from AMD, which just barely outperformed Ice Lake with its highest-end Renoir configuration. Next up, we have our Excel large number calculation test, which like many functions in Excel uses multi-threading and hits the cache quite hard. For a CPU with just 4 cores, the Core i7-1165G7 punches above its weight, outperforming the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 Pro 4650U and matching the Ryzen 7 4700U in the higher power class. While not the overall fastest CPU in this division, that goes to the 4800U, the 1165G7 is a good mobile processor for Excel workloads. When Renoir hit the market, AMD was able to claw out a victory in PC Mark X's Essentials test, especially with their high-end Ryzen 7 APUs. In this workload, which covers app loading, light web browsing, and video conferencing, the i7-1165G7 does offer 12% more performance than previous generation parts, so it's able to match the Ryzen 7 4800U for basic workloads. Given the 4800U is quite rare on the market, perhaps the 4700U is a better comparison, where the 1165G7 is slightly faster in the 7 to 8% range. For this review, I'm switching from using PCMark's productivity workload to the application workload, which uses the more commonly used Microsoft Office suite and Edge web browser as opposed to open source apps like LibreOffice. Given that most areas to web browsing and Office apps are single-threaded, it's no surprise that Tiger Lake is the more powerful platform here. However, the performance lead is really only apparent when the 1165G7 is allowed to use 28 watts of power. In this range, the 1165G7 is 14% faster than the 4800U when viewing the overall application score, and 22% faster than the 4700U. These numbers drop a bit to 5% and 12% respectively when comparing at 15 watts, which is a much narrower margin. Like in our custom workload, Excel is the strongest result for Ryzen, while PowerPoint is king on Tiger Lake. Another lighter workload that is common for ultra-portable laptops is compression and decompression work. Here we're looking at compression, and as the test is multi-threaded, this is an area where Tiger Lake falls behind relative to Ryzen 7 processors. At 28 watts, the 1165G7 is around that of the Ryzen 5 Pro 4650U, while at 15 watts, it's slightly ahead of the 4500U. Compression isn't Zen's strong suit, but the power and efficiency of their 8-core design is too strong. Decompression is especially weak on the 1165G7, getting absolutely destroyed in particular by the SMT-enabled parts in AMD's lineup. The battle between Tiger Lake and the 4700U is much smaller, however the 1165G7 is still at least 25% slower, which makes Ryzen the clear choice for those that do a lot of decompression work on their laptop. On the other hand, another more lower level task that is often key to performance is cryptography, and here Intel's accelerated AES-256 block is substantially faster than Ryzen. It's actually pulled even further away from Ice Lake on average, delivering at least 40% more performance than Ryzen laptops. This test is quite memory sensitive, so the gains are higher on LPDDR4X laptops that have higher bandwidth. Acrobat PDF to image exporting is highly single-threaded, so it's no surprise that the 1165G7 is the fastest mobile CPU we've tested. We're seeing performance 20% better than the 1065G7, around the mark of our Cinebench results, which allows it to handily beat Ryzen 7 by 20 to 25%. Next up is Adobe Photoshop. In Puget's benchmark, which covers most commonly used functions in Photoshop, Tiger Lake performs very well as single-thread performance still reigns king in this application. Like other workloads, the gains are much more substantial at 28 watts than they are at 15 watts, with the 1165G7 performing 12% better than the 4700U at the higher power class, but just 3% better at 15 watts. Still, double-digit gains over Ice Lake is quite handy. We'll finish up the productivity workloads with our hardware-accelerated benchmarks. Tiger Lake's new Meteor engine, alongside a more powerful GPU, allows it to offset the lack of CPU cores in the Puget Premiere Export test, a test which on integrated graphics is often GPU limited. It's not a resounding win for the 1165G7, given it's faster than Ryzen 7 APUs at 28 watts but slower at 15 watts, but it is significantly faster than last generation CPUs in this test. And just as a quick note, we tested this app using the latest beta versions that fully support Ryzen APUs for hardware acceleration. So this is no longer a test where Intel is running hardware accelerated while AMD is left to render on the CPU. These are proper, fair accelerated benchmarks. Thanks to Adobe for reaching out and letting me know that they've fixed a range of long-standing bugs with Premiere on Ryzen APUs. Where Tiger Lake's Meteor engine is really allowed to shine is in the playback test. The 1165G7 is substantially faster than other integrated GPU solutions at 28 watts, and performance is still slightly ahead of the Ryzen 7 4800U at 15 watts. For DaVinci Resolve exports, there's not much separating the Ryzen 7 4800U and Core i7-1165G7 in their higher power classes, and the 1165G7 is just 8% ahead of the 4700U. However, roles are reversed at 15 watts, with the 4700U now the faster chip. Realistically, in such a GPU-limited test such as DaVinci, you won't want to be exporting too many files on an ultra-portable laptop APU. You can see here that as soon as you add a decent discrete GPU into the mix like you get in the XMG Core 14, performance nearly doubles, and it only grows from there with beefier GPUs and CPUs. And finally, we're going to close out the productivity tests with hardware-accelerated handbrake encoding using either NVENC, VCE, or QuickSync. Handbrake still heavily utilized as part of the CPU for this test, so despite having a decent encoding engine, the 1165G7 here is CPU limited and slots between the Ryzen 5 4500U and Ryzen 5 Pro 4650U. This can be bumped up a class through the use of an NVIDIA discrete GPU, which despite QuickSync's improvements, still appears to hold the superior H.265 encoder. With that said, QuickSync is clearly doing quite a bit of work here, as previously with CPU-only encoding, the 1165G7 was 35% slower than the 4700U. With hardware acceleration for both, the 1165G7 is 25% slower, suggesting QuickSync to be faster than AMD's VCE. Now moving into gaming performance, and here we'll start with Grand Theft Auto 5. Here are the results with the CPU at 15 watts, and what you'll spot is the 1165G7 isn't all that competitive in this power class up against Ryzen, falling below the Ryzen 5 option even with fast LPDDR4X memory. At 15 watts, there is some merit to including a low-power discrete GPU like the MX350, which is substantially faster than other integrated options in this game. At 28 watts, the 1165G7 is significantly more competitive, matching the Ryzen 7 4700U and 4800U and getting close to previous MX250 discrete options. NVIDIA GPUs are still the far better choice for this game though, with the GTX 1650 providing over double the frame rate in some situations using low settings. In Civilization 6, the 1165G7 is able to match the Ryzen 7 4700U on average frame rate at 15 watts, which is quite neat and shows strong progress for Intel's new Xe GPU in a game that did not run well on Ice Lake. We're seeing better performance than the MX250, but not quite at the level of the 4800U or MX350. At 28 watts, the i7-1165G7 is able to flex its muscles a bit more and get much closer to the 4800U, now exceeding the performance on offer from the 4700U and MX350. In CSGO, you'll be wanting an 1165G7 laptop with LPDDR4X memory because there is a significant performance discrepancy between this memory and DDR4 configurations. With DDR4, we are only seeing performance at the level of the Ryzen 7 4700U, but with LPDDR4X, Intel pulls ahead of the 4800U. At 28 watts, the performance combination of Intel's high-frequency, fast Xe GPU and strong single-thread performance allows the 1165G7 to be far faster for gaming in this title. Gears 5 running at 1080p medium settings is very punishing on integrated GPUs. At 15 watts, the i7-1165G7 sits between the Ryzen 7 4700U and 4800U in terms of performance. But at 25 watts, the Intel processor is substantially faster, offering a 15% higher average frame rate than the 4800U, even when using the slower DDR4 memory option. It's also faster than Nvidia's MX350. Similar story in F1 2019. At 15 watts, the 1165G7 sits between the 4700U and 4800U in terms of performance, although it requires LPDDR4X memory to get there. Both products fall short of Nvidia's MX350. At 25 watts though, especially with LPDDR4X memory, Intel is clearly the faster option with about a 20% lead on the 4800U and Nvidia MX350. And finally we get to Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p medium settings, where at 28 watts the 1165G7 delivers a really playable experience around the 60fps mark, quite a bit ahead of AMD's best Ryzen 7 APUs. This lead holds true at 15 watts as well, although only with LPDDR4X memory, as again DDR4 is quite a hindrance on Intel's integrated GPU performance due to far lower memory bandwidth. Combining these data points for gaming suggests that in the higher power class with LPDDR4X memory, the 1165G7 is at worst around the mark of a Ryzen 7 4800U, and in the best cases, 30% faster or more. DDR4 configurations will be worse. Then at 15 watts, Tiger Lake isn't as efficient and will likely fall between the 4700U and 4800U, which all things considered is still a very competitive result for Intel. Before getting into the conclusion, let's look at some overall performance comparisons. The i7-1165G7 is a substantial upgrade on the i7-1065G7 at the higher 28 and 25 watt power configurations, especially for designs that have both the same core count. Intel are offering 20% better multi-thread performance and upwards of 30% better single-thread performance in some workloads, plus a much faster GPU. At 15 watts, the margins are much narrower, with 15% better single-thread performance and 10% better multi-thread performance in typical workloads. That's still a gain, but points to Intel's 10nm SuperFin being more optimized for 28 watt power classes versus 15 watts. That's evident even in Intel's own graphs, comparing Sunny Cove and Willow Cove, where the gap between these designs grows as voltage increases. So what we end up with is quite a large difference between the 15 watt and 28 watt configurations, with gains seen even in single-threaded workloads, as hitting that 4.8 GHz mark will require more than 15 watts on a single core. Comparing the 1165G7 to AMD's more commonly used Ryzen 7 4700U processor, these parts trade blows. AMD's design is faster for multi-thread performance, often substantially so given the core count discrepancy. However, the 1165G7 is up to 25% faster for single-threaded workloads, and that leads to better performance in areas like Office applications and Photoshop. The 1165G7 is also faster for hardware acceleration like in Premiere or DaVinci. However, the gap between Tiger Lake and the 4700U shrinks at the lower power class, with AMD able to claw back some wins on occasion. It's much the same when pitting the 1165G7 up against AMD's Ryzen 7 4800U. The 4800U's lead in multi-core tests grows quite a bit when adding in SMT. However, the 1165G7 is still the faster processor for single-threaded tasks and accelerated workloads. Again, at 15 watts, the margins are more in AMD's favour, but Intel is still able to provide better performance in some key workloads. Alright, so you've seen all the benchmarks. Time for what I hope will be a short conclusion, but will likely be much longer than I'm expecting. The Core i7-1165G7 is one of Intel's better CPUs to hit the market in the last 5 years. Both Intel's desktop and mobile CPU offerings have stagnated for quite some time, more so on the desktop side, but there has been criticism across all areas of Intel's CPU division, and rightly so for the most part. The 1165G7 presents the most substantial gains over the direct prior generation since Kaby Lake Refresh, which bumped Intel's U-Series mobile lineup from 2 to 4 cores. This is down to significant improvements across all areas of the chip. 10nm superfin has allowed Intel to substantially increase CPU frequencies versus Ice Lake, and this leads to much better single-thread and multi-thread performance given these gains are seen at the same voltage level. The Xe GPU is even better, providing an enormous performance leap on the 1065G7. This is complemented by a strong set of platform features like Thunderbolt, PCIe 4.0, and improvements to the Meteor engine and other areas. The gains over Ice Lake are largest in the higher power configuration, which for this generation is 28 watts. It's clear why Intel has placed so much focus on this TDP up configuration, as the 1165G7 isn't nearly as impressive at 15 watts. In some instances, Intel requires the extra power to beat AMD's Zen 2 based Ryzen APUs, with Ryzen generally being the more efficient design for lower power systems at 15 watts. In the battle between Tiger Lake and Ryzen Renoir, the talking point that continually bobs up is the CPU core count. AMD fans love to dunk on Intel for only producing a quad-core design for ultra-portable laptops compared to AMD's 8-core design, but that's being pretty unfair to Intel in my opinion, as the 1165G7 has other strengths which are very relevant for the thin and light notebook market. In a lot of these simple, everyday lighter tasks that buyers generally use an ultra-portable laptop for, Intel provides better performance. Thanks to much higher single-thread performance, the Core i7-1165G7 is faster than AMD's Ryzen 7 4700U or 4800U for things like web browsing, app loading, Microsoft Office apps, photo editing in Photoshop, and even some accelerated encoding work. These are most of the core workloads for an ultra-portable laptop design. I mean, generally you wouldn't do, say, CPU-based rendering on a laptop, whereas on a desktop that's obviously a much more important test. How much faster than AMD we are looking at depends on the workload, the power configuration, and the Ryzen 7 CPU in question. But generally I was seeing 10 to 20% more performance in these apps, which is a decent difference. AMD is able to shave off quite a bit of that margin if we're talking about 15 watt designs with the 1165G7 going up against the Ryzen 7 4800U, but unfortunately for AMD, the 4800U is a bit of a rare beast. Intel are more often going to be competing against the far more common Ryzen 7 4700U, which itself is still reasonably rare given supply constraints, and the 1165G7 is able to pull further ahead versus that design. Intel are able to complement the everyday workload package with better integrated gaming performance, again, especially at the higher TDP. So if the main things you do on your laptop are web browsing, Office app productivity, photo editing, and a bit of light gaming, then the Core i7-1165G7 is the better mobile processor to get. I suspect this will cover a large portion of ultra-thin laptop buyers, so while I'm sure Intel would love to be able to offer 8 cores, they don't really need to be competitive. On the other hand, AMD's Ryzen 7 APUs with 8 cores are substantially faster for any heavily multi-threaded CPU-limited work. While Intel may be 10 to 20% faster for basic tasks, AMD are over 50% faster in multi-threaded tests, which easily makes a 4700U or 4800U better if the apps you use hit a lot of CPU cores. People that want a super portable laptop for code compilation, compression work, data crunching in Excel, or CPU-based video encoding should all look to Ryzen. And if you are specifically after an ultra-thin, say 13-inch design that operates at 15 watts, you can also throw in a few more wins like in Premiere and in some games. And this brings me back to something I said in my reviews of Ryzen 4000 APUs. AMD are able to offer transformative performance for ultra-portable laptops, bringing what used to be H-series 45-watt performance that required more bulky laptops into nice thin and light designs. I can't really say the same about the Core i7-1165G7 because the multi-thread performance simply isn't there. So ultimately, right now, there is no single best choice for an ultra-portable laptop between the Core i7-1165G7 and a Ryzen 7 APU. It will come down to how you use your laptop and what matters most to you. Personally, and this is just my opinion, I don't really use my laptop for a lot of heavy processing work, that's what my desktop is for, so the basic web browsing and, say, light photo editing work that the 1165G7 offers is probably what I'd be after. But I can still see Ryzen being attractive, especially for people like coders, and I also expect Ryzen laptops to generally be cheaper, which is a whole other element to factor in. A couple of final notes to round this one out. First one is that we only focused on performance in this review. We didn't talk about any other aspects to the platform, in particular battery life, which is difficult to test given the differences between individual laptop models. You should look to specific laptop reviews from other people when choosing a laptop based on battery life. While getting more performance at the same power level generally leads to better battery life as you can do more within a charge, it doesn't tell you much about idle power and all those things, so again, you should read reviews. Secondly, Intel right now and for the last decade has had the more mature laptop ecosystem. While Ryzen was a step in the right direction for this, a massive step in the right direction, there are still very few premium ultra-thin AMD designs, while Intel is used in every major high-end laptop from nearly every brand. Think Dell XPS, Razer Blade, HP Spectre, and so on. Combined with things like Thunderbolt support, this is a big factor in Intel's favor, and that may sway you more towards Team Blue. Thirdly, we are hearing AMD's Zen 3 APUs for laptops are not far away. I'd be expecting them in the first quarter of 2021. So while Tiger Lake may be the superior platform for single thread and GPU performance right now, that could change in a few months, especially given what we've seen from Zen 3 on the desktop. We'll keep an eye out for that one, but obviously this doesn't help you if you want to buy a laptop right now. And lastly, I just want to touch on Intel's marketing again. I criticised Intel's launch presentation for showing Intel destroying AMD in niche accelerated workloads like AI upscaling and a Premiere test that's clearly hardware accelerated on Intel and not on AMD. This sort of highly cherry-picked data is really not required to sell a product, and people, at least in our enthusiast community, don't buy it. Tiger Lake has plenty of strong points, like we've shown throughout this review. There is no need to punch down, just focus on the strengths in realistic workloads and be honest about the product. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Core i7-1165G7. Big thanks to XMG and Schenker for setting out some of the laptops that were used for testing in this review. I was actually very impressed with the XMG Core 14, the combination of the 1165G7 and that GTX 1650 GPU make it a really powerful laptop, I think, and quite useful for people that do, say, Premiere editing on the go. So that's definitely one to be on the lookout out of the bunch that we tested here today. We'll be back soon to test the 1185G7. That's right, the 1185G7. We've got a laptop with that in it to test soon. And then hopefully later on, not quite sure when, but we will be getting to testing Core i5 models in this lineup as well, just to complete the sort of Tiger Lake look for this set of reviews. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this one. It's been a long one, lots and lots of testing. This has been weeks of work to get this one done, and then weeks more work of coordination to get all the laptops in for testing. So, phew, long one. Thanks for supporting us in places like Patreon or Floatplane. Big shout out to you guys. That's it. I'll catch you in the next one.